Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire, which had ruled across Europe for 600 years, was facing collapse. More than 100 years earlier, in 332, its Emperor Constantine, who'd erected his Victory Arch in Rome, had moved the capital of the empire to a city in modern-day Turkey, which was named Constantinople. Constantine was the first Roman emperor to become a Christian, and over the next 1,000 years, his Eastern Roman Empire embraced Christianity and became the Byzantine Empire.
Constantine changed the course of human history. With his adoption of Christianity, Christianity goes from a persecuted minority sect to being the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Other Christian forces were more aggressive, as Crusaders fought to retake Christendom's holy lands and sites from another, younger religion on the march, Islam. Meanwhile, Europe's great new seafaring and trading power, Venice, sought accommodation and profit from all sides, whether Christian, Jew, or Muslim, in a complex game of shifting alliances, hostility, and war. In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore 10 sites that made history as we chart the rise and fall of these great Christian empires. Our story begins on the shores of the Bosphorus, in a city famed as the gateway between East and West, Istanbul. Bustling, cosmopolitan, and multifaceted, Istanbul is Turkey's largest city and has long been recognized as one of the great crossroads of the world. Its magnificent architecture and teeming bazaars are remnants of an ancient and glorious past. The domes and lofty minarets that punctuate the skyline of today's Istanbul are ever-present reminders of the city's Muslim identity. But for centuries, the city was known as Constantinople and was the epicenter of the Christian Roman Empire of Byzantium.
From the birth of the faith with Christ to the spread of the faith with St. Paul the Apostle, under Constantine the Emperor, it's at last a place where it can begin to settle and mature.
He looks like a boxer to me. He actually killed his eldest son and his wife for fear of plotting. So he's a very single-minded man who rises to the top of the pool, and for the first time in quite a while, he unites the Roman Empire under one ruler.
Constantine's legacy is still with us. It's Christendom. He was the one who picked up this suppressed Jewish, mystic philosopher and wrapped him up in the power of Rome.
This city that he founded in his own name, at a very strategic location where Europe meets Asia, is going to have an enormously important role to play in the history of Europe and the Middle East, and an incredible longevity that runs right down to today. And I think we see that as one of his main contributions to world history.
It was Constantine who began the construction of the walls of Constantinople, still here today, more than 1,500 years after they were built. Completed successfully by later emperors, they defended the city against foes of the Eastern Roman Empire for 1,000 years.
The walls of Constantinople were the most formidable pieces of engineering in the Greco-Roman world. They were incredibly important in terms of barricading this city off. Constantinople is triangular and two sides are surrounded by water. These in themselves provide a bulwark against attack. The land walls were really resistant to any form of technology until the Ottomans came along with gunpowder in 1453. This really allows the city to resist waves of invaders, one after another, throughout the centuries, and to function as a hub of the Byzantine Empire and a shield, really, for Christian Europe.
It was Emperor Justinian who constructed the other great monument of Constantinople and the Byzantium Empire, the great Christian citadel Hagia Sophia in 532, more than 250 years after the city's founding by Constantine. For the next 1,000 years, this was to remain the largest building in Christendom.
It's a remarkable building. There's a wonderful, wonderful dome 100 feet tall at the center of it that was covered in golden mosaics, images of Christ and the Virgin Mary and the saints. Chapels surround this, and from the outside you get this impression of enormous solidity, but inside there's an incredible space. It's almost as if the ceiling is floating in there. 10 different sorts of marble adorn the walls, drawn from all over the Byzantine Empire. It truly did glorify God, and it was also meant to impress any visitor to Constantinople.
It's just got majesty, it's got sublimity, it's about light, its very name, holy wisdom. There's a sort of mystical wisp still in the air of the mood of that building.
He believed that he had created a religious building of greater magnificence than the first Temple of Jerusalem. The cubic sense of space, the great dome 100 feet across. At that time, this astonished people. The beauty of the building, the marble columns, the upper floor with an enormous gallery, but above all the dome, which the contemporary writer Procopius said, the dome as if suspended by a golden chain from heaven.
The minarets surrounding Hagia Sophia today were added later, after the Muslim conquest of the city in 1453, when the building was turned into a mosque, but it remains one of Byzantium's greatest ever constructions. The dome is almost 200 feet from floor level at its highest point, and it rests on an arcade with 40 arched windows. The building is essentially square. Its immense space is highlighted further by half-domes, in addition to the giant central dome. There was an upper gallery added to segregate the classes attending the church. The project was to give its creator, Justinian, a special place in Byzantium history.
He played a very significant role in the development of the Byzantine Empire to stabilize it in many ways. He was literally a towering figure because the column of Justinian, reputed to be 70 meters tall, with a statue of Justinian on a horse holding an orb with a cross on it, was visible from the sea. And this was in place until Mehmet the Conqueror knocked it down after 1453. It was there so long, over such a long period of time, that people forgot who it was, and they actually thought it was Constantine. But throughout the whole of Byzantine history, Justinian was up there on this pedestal, just outside Hagia Sophia. So he'd given himself both a secular and a religious monument to be remembered by.
The Byzantium Empire inherited Roman military technologies and grew far and wide, covering most of the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, providing a Christian shield for Europe against new religions and tribes. Ruins of this great empire are scattered across the region today. In northwest Syria, they are known as the Dead Cities. The region was famous for its wine and olive oil production. The region's most impressive ruin is the Roman Basilica at San Simeon. It was here, in the late 5th century, that the Byzantine Emperor Zeno decided to build the most sumptuous and elaborate Christian place of worship. It covered 5,000 square feet and could hold some 10,000 people. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the basilica is the man it was built to commemorate. San Simeon, a monk who lived on top of a pillar on this site for some 40 years. Shortly after his death, construction of the basilica began, centering around his legendary pillar, the remains of which still can be found right in the middle of the church.
At that time it was about 65 feet. He lived all 40 years on top on a platform of, we can say, 2 meters by 2 meters, alone, eating once a week, drinking once a day, flagellating himself, and in winter time he was naked all the time under the snow, under the rain, praying 20 hours a day. He's doing the fast for 40 days, going in comas. His idea is we have to suffer to go to the heaven.
By the time of his death in 577, San Simeon had created one of the biggest pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom, and the basilica, built less than 20 years later, became a symbol of Christianity's growing popularity in the region. But it wasn't to last. By the 7th century, Muslim armies from the Arabian Peninsula swept across Syria, pushing back the frontiers of Byzantium. In the 11th century, the Muslim armies finally took the holy city of Jerusalem. This set off alarm bells across the Christian world. Outraged Christians across Europe vowed to take it back. After Pope Urban II announced a Christian holy war in 1095, the Crusades were born. As many as 80,000 answered the call and set out across Europe to retake the Holy Land.
In November 1095, when Pope Urban II launched an appeal for an armed expedition to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, he tapped in to many, many key themes in Western European life. To the knights of Europe, he offered them a chance of salvation. They could go to the Holy Land, they could fight, and they could get forgiveness of the many, many sins that they had committed. They also had an opportunity for honor. They want to show off to one another. They want to be great men. They could gain renown in achieving this liberation of the Christian city. And Jerusalem, of course, was the most important place to Christians. So what greater act could there be for knights than going on this great, wonderful, noble, as they put it, adventure to recover Christ's city for their faith?
The Crusaders included members of royalty and aristocracy, knights from across Europe who left their lands and fortresses to join the Holy War.
Knights had a theological problem, really, was that they were dedicated to violence, but most of this violence was, by its very nature, sinful. And Urban managed to combine faith and violence together. You can fulfill your warrior code while fulfilling a Christian mission.
The Crusaders traveled across Europe and down through Turkey to reach the Holy Land, before a force of about 12,000 finally reached Jerusalem.
In the summer of 1099, the armies of the First Crusade surrounded the walled city of Jerusalem. After a long siege, the Crusaders finally get a foothold on the walls and break into the Holy City. There then follows a terrible massacre of the Muslim and Jewish defenders. There is a bloodbath. When they get in there, they are so ecstatic to liberate the Holy City as they saw it. To them, the only explanation for this success must be that God has approved of their actions.
Is what caused the First Crusade. This building, literally built by Constantine and his mother, St. Helena.
Built on what is believed to be the location of Jesus Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the city's most important Christian site.
In the minds of the knights of Western Europe, the Holy Sepulchre, Christ's tomb, was of absolute paramount importance. They say this when they're setting out, they're going to liberate Christ's tomb. When they get there in the summer of 1099, there's the rotunda there, there's a few other buildings. But frankly, in some ways, it's a slight disappointment as a building. What they do, therefore, is they decide to embellish it, to give it the appropriate structure for its importance and its honor in the Christian mind. In the aftermath of the conquest of Jerusalem, a remarkable discovery was made in the precincts of the Holy Sepulchre. A piece of wood believed to be part of the true cross, the cross upon which Christ was crucified, was discovered. This, of course, was a relic of enormous importance to the Crusaders. Christ ascended to heaven, so there are no bodily remains, and this object from this most central part of his life, his death, is there. This, then, is their talisman. And whenever the Kingdom of Jerusalem is attacked in subsequent years, they take it out of its chapel and they take it out at the head of their army and parade it in front of the troops.
I think if Jerusalem was the place that you needed to go to fulfill your vows and to seek absolution for your sins, the epicenter of Jerusalem was the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Christ was buried. As people came back, travelers' tales, stories of, the devotional moment of weeping in front of the tomb, this gave it a reality that it maybe hadn't had before.
This is the fourth version of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was destroyed by the Persians in 614, the Muslims in 1009, and then by fire in the 19th century. It houses several stations of the cross, Christ's final journey. The three most significant are Calvary, the site of the crucifixion, situated on the south side of the altar. The stone of anointing, where the body was prepared for burial, is located just inside the entrance to the church. The rotunda is situated beneath the larger of the two domes inside the church. In the center of the rotunda is a chapel called the Erected, which contains the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ.
To have a fine building surrounding these places of central importance to Christian belief is very, very significant, because thousands and thousands of pilgrims, after the Crusaders have captured the Holy Land, will want to come and worship at the holy places. So you need something that will draw them and that they can then actually worship and venerate these places with proper respect and reverence. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, many of the Crusaders went back home to Europe. But a small group stay, capture the coastal cities of the Levant, and found what we call the Crusader states. But as time goes on, the Muslim world realizes that the Christians are there to stay. It was the First Crusade, and they only slowly began to understand it as a war of Christian colonization. The idea of jihad, a basic part of the Islamic faith, was rather in abeyance at the time of the First Crusade. There was no strong jihad spirit. But in the course of the 12th century, various Muslim leaders start to draw this out, most particularly Saladin. He emphasizes the importance of Jerusalem to the Muslim faith and the importance of jihad to the people of the Near East.
In 1187, Saladin, the legendary Muslim warrior king who'd united Arabs across the Middle East, took on the Christian forces and comprehensively defeated them here at the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee in modern-day Israel.
The king of Jerusalem makes a terrible, terrible mistake. He abandons a safe water supply and tries to march across the arid plateau to relieve the town of Tiberias. Saladin's troops surround him. They fire arrows to pick off the foot soldiers. They slow down the cavalrymen. Overnight, the Crusaders, parched throats, are tortured by the firing of arrows with blazing arrows to dry them out even more. The following day, the Christians struggle up to the Horns of Hattin. It's an old volcano, and they make their last stand within the crater itself.
In victory, Saladin's forces also took possession of the Crusaders' prized talisman, the True Cross, a relic from Christ's crucifixion.
To see the annihilation of an army of 20,000 men was devastating for the Crusaders' cause. It allowed Saladin to capture 52 towns. He almost swept the board, from Accra to Jaffa to Beirut, and many of these towns just surrendered. What Hattin actually led to was a whole new cycle of crusading, because the loss of Jerusalem was deemed to be an extraordinary 9/11 moment, probably, in medieval Europe. Urban III, the Pope, was said to have died of shock when he heard the news, and this leads a ratcheting up of commitment. There had been really quite a decline of Crusader enthusiasm after the Second Crusade, which hadn't achieved very much. And then, for the first time, we see kings guaranteeing to go on crusade.
In response to the loss of Jerusalem once more, it was the great English king Richard the Lionheart who headed a new Crusader force to the Holy Land with the intention of retaking the city and the True Cross.
Richard was genuinely an immense figure of his time. Even his Muslim opponents gave him a pretty good CV. I think somebody wrote, never so bold or so subtle an opponent. And it's interesting that they rated his subtlety as well as his boldness. He was preeminently a warrior. He'd been leading armies at the age of 16. He was, as far as we can make out, physically quite an imposing guy.
Richard the Lionheart is a white, gay, royal terrorist. He's a nightmare of a man. He fought all his life. He had no compassion for any peasant community, any trading community, any city. He was just a sort of gay fighting machine. He's an absolute repellent figure, and it's extraordinary he stands outside Westminster Palace.
He had a reputation for exemplary cruelty, taking out cities and massacring people in France. He was, by all accounts, quite a terse man, kind of to the point. I think one of his nicknames was yes and no. Those were the answers that you got from Richard. He was physically prepared to fight in the front rank and to lead by example, but he was also a pretty astute military tactician.
On Saladin's part, he sees Richard as a formidable enemy. In fact, he says he's a bit too rash when it comes to battle. He shouldn't go quite in so full on in the course of a conflict. But he also sees a man who's, again, a dangerous diplomat. Any splits in the Muslim ranks, Richard's there trying to exploit them. He's a man who's prepared to engage in diplomacy, cultural chat, and so there's rather more to Richard than just a dangerous warrior. And so there's a healthy respect between the two of them. With the capture of the True Cross at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin has an object of enormous significance and resonance to the Christians. They are desperate to get this talismanic object back under their control. And over the next few decades, they're always trying to exchange it, barter it, buy it, get it back from the Muslims. It seems that some of Richard the Lionheart's envoys may have seen it in Damascus. By the time you get to the 13th century, it was probably in Baghdad. And after that, the trail really starts going cold. Accra is a tremendously important site in the history of the Crusades. It's the main port for the Crusader states. It's their lifeline to Western Europe. Without that lifeline, pilgrims and traders could not have arrived in the Holy Land and kept the place going economically.
It was fortresses like this at Accra, on Israel's north coast, site of a siege between Christians and Muslims that lasted almost 2 years, that set the scene for a complex war game over territory between the two warrior kings.
The contest between these two men is fascinating. I think it's one of the great personal confrontations of history, actually. These two equally matched warriors, who are also tacticians and subtle diplomats. They play effectively a game of chess, both in military and diplomatic. They never meet.
Richard won the first siege of Acre with a bloody but controversial tactic.
Of course, the thing that he's best known for is after the Crusaders have recaptured Acre from Saladin, and there had been an agreement that the Muslim inhabitants should be spared, he marches them outside and he kills them.
Richard may have won the siege, but the legendary battles with Saladin ended in a stalemate. Saladin kept Jerusalem, but Christian pilgrims were able to visit freely.
Acre as a city, under Crusader rule, is described as a dirty, noisy, smelly place. It's a port. It's a really active, dynamic port. There are people coming from all over Western Europe as pilgrims. They're being brought on the ships of the Genoese, the Venetians, and the Pisans. And there they meet the Frankish settlers who rule the place, and also traders from the interior of the Muslim world. So it's a real melting pot. It's also the home of some of the great military orders. You've got this enormous complex built by the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the Hospitallers, which has a huge infirmary in it, has enormous wonderful halls, administrative centres. So you've got to imagine it as a place of great government and authority as well. It becomes the capital of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 13th century, and it's their last great stronghold that manages to hold out until 1291, when the Mamluks, after a great siege, finally break in, sack the place, and end the Christian presence in the Holy Land for several centuries.
The land of Palestine was partitioned, with Crusaders holding onto a rump of coastal territory, including their fortress complex won after the siege at Acre.
Forts allowed the control of territory. They could create vassalages around the forts.
In fact, until 1291, there was a network of fortresses scattered across the Holy Land, including this one at Karak. But the most famous fortress of all was across the border in modern-day Syria.
Cretty Chevalier is located overlooking the Homs Valley. So really, the north of Lebanon and the south of Syria, there's a big fertile valley that goes from the inland of Syria out to the coast, where a lot of the Crusaders are settled. And so if the Muslims were looking to attack the Frankish farmlands, they've got to get past Cretty Chevalier. It's there sitting on top of the hill, overlooking the valley, and you go past it at your peril. Cretty Chevalier is widely regarded as the greatest castle in the world. It's an amazing structure. It must have been built at enormous expense. Beautiful finished stone surrounding it, the outer wall, the inner wall, and then the courtyard. If you go there, what strikes one is the fact that it's an enormous muscle almost. Castles in England and Wales have got big courtyard spaces in them. The middle of Cretty Chevalier is dense. There's a very, very small area. It's just walls and towers. It's also the place where the Hospitallers were based. The Hospitallers are a religious order, and so in it there's actually a chapel. There's almost a very slight sense of being in a monastery in the middle of it. But it really is the scale that just give this place an enormous impression of strength.
This impregnable fortress was never taken. Even in defeat in 1271, the Crusader Knights were given safe passage out of the fortress after a truce. After their eviction from the Holy Land, some Crusaders ended up here in Cyprus. The island became home for a French Crusader group known as the Lusinians. Headed by Guy de Lusignan, a self-styled Crusader king of Jerusalem, when the order relocated to Cyprus, they turned the island's valuable port city, Famagusta, into the center of their operations. This setback in the Crusades turned into a fantastic opportunity as they found themselves at the nexus of a flourishing east-west trade route. For 3 centuries, the island was the easternmost outpost of Christendom, and Famagusta, a great Crusader stronghold, and also, briefly, the wealthiest city on earth. This was because of a papal edict which forbade commercial relations between Europe and the Muslim world. This turned the port city into a kind of clearinghouse for the exchange of commodities between East and West. This, in turn, made it an attractive proposition for those great traders of the Mediterranean, the Venetians.
This is the first empire that was organized along economic lines, really. Venice had no land. It had to live entirely by trade. Everybody in this city is effectively a merchant. They work out that what you need to do is to have the goods that people will want to come to Venice to buy. So they send out their fleets along organized set routes up into the Black Sea to get grain and fish, to Alexandria to get spices and silk from the Islamic world, to North Africa, and eventually as far as Bruges and London.
In the hundreds of years since it declared itself independent of the Byzantine Empire in 727, Venice had developed into a thriving maritime trading power.
They understand that if you're a maritime empire, you have to have incredibly good shipbuilding facilities. The Venetian arsenal is the most sophisticated shipbuilding facility in the medieval world.
With 36,000 sailors and 3,300 ships, Venice was indeed the mistress of the Mediterranean, its fleet providing a vital trading link between Christian Europe and the exotic and often hostile East.
They occupied the power vacuum from the declining Byzantine Empire at about 1000 to the rise of the Ottoman 1500. They occupied this space for about 500 years. All the good things of the world in the Middle Ages, as far as Europe is concerned, spices, silks, pearls, come from beyond the European world. They come from the Middle East. So to be able to trade in Egypt and Syria is incredibly important.
The Venetian sphere of influence was growing, particularly after their dubious role in the sacking of Constantinople in the failed Fourth Crusade of 1204. In fact, it was all about money. After the Crusaders couldn't pay the Venetians for helping to outfit the crusade, including the provision of shipping, the Crusaders, rogue Byzantine elements, and the Venetians themselves decided to get the money from Constantinople. Constantinople was never to truly recover its old glories. Byzantium's loss was Venice's gain. The citadel of Venetian power was St. Mark's Cathedral in St. Mark's Square. And its crowning glory were these 4 bronze horses, ancient relics of Byzantium, stolen during the sacking and placed here prominently on display.
St. Mark's is a remarkable building. It's a medieval building, but inside it, it's clearly got a strong influence of Byzantium. The mosaics, the beautiful golden mosaics are there, and so you feel like you're moving perhaps between East and West in some senses. It's also got a magnificent treasury adorned with many of the relics taken after the sack of Constantinople.
It's kind of like a bric-a-brac of things that are plundered from other places, you know, columns from Syria, statues from Constantinople. The 4 horses also came from Constantinople. There are glimpses of styles in these buildings that come from the Islamic world because they'd seen the buildings of Syria and they traded in Alexandria. When I think of Venice, I think of it as somewhere that reminds you of everywhere else you can see. You look at the domes of St. Mark's, you think that there's something a bit Islamic about this. You look at the canals and you think this is a bit like Bruges, quite Gothic. And yet, when you put it all together, it's like nothing else. It's a city of borrowing. This is the only city in Italy that didn't exist in Roman times. So they borrow, they plunder whatever they need. They steal the bodies of Saints St. Mark and various other saints to create their own relics, which will bring people to the city. It's a sort of massive business corporation that's taking whatever it can.
Venice's head of state, elected for life, was called a doge, and he ruled from here, the doge's palace. No other building in the city better represents the wealth and power of the Venetian Republic. Its distinctive take on the highly ornate Gothic style became emblematic of the Republic's golden age. The facade of the Doge's palace perfectly encapsulates Venice's role as commercial middleman between East and West. Its first floor, with its beautiful arcade of pointed arches with their trefoil infills, wouldn't look out of place in a mosque. And then there are the coloured tiles above. They come from a little further afield, Persia. Finally, there is the crenulated roofline, which is borrowed from North African mosque architecture. The interior of this quite incredible building features all of the doges throughout Venice's history. This room, with its magnificent painted ceiling and walls depicting Venetian triumphs, was where the Grand Council met to discuss and vote on the affairs of state. But Venice's middleman role was to become an increasingly difficult act to pull off as the Ottoman Empire's power expanded in the Mediterranean.
This means that they're going to find themselves squeezed between two conflicting forces, and they play this game as cleverly as they can to try and carve out and maintain a space between militant Islam on one side and militant Christianity on the other, to be free traders. And they play it with a great deal of diplomatic skill, but it becomes increasingly difficult. The air in the room shrinks as the Ottomans advance, and the pressures in the Mediterranean build up.
After the conquest of Constantinople, Venice had inherited a string of ports and imperial territories, fully a quarter of what remained of the old Roman Empire. It set about constructing massive defensive fortresses, such as on the island of Crete, protecting its far-flung trading empire from the expanding Ottomans.
I think the horrible word to describe the Venetian view of their relationship with the Ottomans is that they were frenemies, you know, both friends and enemies. They wanted to trade, but we know that you're actually out to crush us, and we're going to do our best to kind of prevent that by whatever tactics we can.
Meanwhile, their mission to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Lands a failure, the Crusader Knights had moved from Cyprus to another Mediterranean island, Rhodes, off the coast of Turkey, where they had been licking their wounds for more than 200 years, all the while creating a magnificent fortress still here today. But now they had a new foe, the Ottoman Turks, who had taken Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christendom, for much of the last 1,000 years, from the Byzantines in 1453. Now under their charismatic Sultan, Suleiman, they threatened Rhodes.
One of the consequences of the establishment of the Crusader states was the creation of the Order of the Knights of St. John, the people we know today as the Knights Hospitaller, a group of warrior monks dedicated to defend the Holy Land and also to look after pilgrims, to provide health care for those who came to the Holy Land and fell sick. But after 1291 and the fall of Acre, they are driven back to Cyprus and then shortly afterwards to Rhodes. And there they base themselves a Christian force in the Eastern Mediterranean, hoping perhaps one day to retake the Holy Land.
Rhodes was a perfect position both as a pirate base to cut at all the sea routes of the Mediterraneans, but it also served as an advanced sort of travel agency for everybody coming on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They'd use the Knights of Rhodes. It was like a banking service, travel agency, and also you could take the option as a young aristocrat doing your sort of year off with serving in the galleys of the Knights of St. John, doing some slave raiding, killing the odd Muslim, come back with a little bit of glory and be buried like a crusader in your hometown.
Because the knights were also carers as well as fighters, the old city of Rhodes has one of the best preserved hospitals of the period. The term hospital is derived directly from the knights' hospitallers. The system they adopted has become the model for our modern hospitals. Knowing it was only a matter of time before the Ottomans would launch an attack, they set about constructing one of the most sophisticated fortresses of its day. Each stretch of the wall was assigned to a different language group, France and Castile guarding the harbour, and Italy, Provence, England, Aragon, Auvergne and Germany manning the leeward sides of the city. When the attack finally came in 1522, the Ottomans bombarded the fortress walls with artillery. After nearly 6 months of relentless siege, the knights, short on supplies and ammunition, had little choice but to surrender. For Christians, it was yet another key stronghold lost to the infidel. As the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V put it at the time, nothing in the world was ever so well lost as Rhodes. And soon, it was the turn of Venice and its leaders to be challenged by the Ottomans. The Venetians may have constructed the most sophisticated fortresses of the day, but in the end, even these supposedly impenetrable fortifications were not enough to protect its fleets, ports, and lucrative trading businesses from disruption.
Fortresses were incredibly important to the Venetians as part of their management of ports and bases. They spent a great deal of money constructing state-of-the-art forts. If you were a military engineer employed by the Venetians, you could earn a good sum. The new science of fortress engineering in the 16th century, when gunpowder comes into play, meant that rather than forts with high walls, you needed to have bastions which deflected shot, a much lower profile. And the Venetians created multiple examples of these. In Crete, particularly Heraklion, which is a stupendous fort with very deep moats or lines of defense which would resist gunfire for a long time. In point of fact, Heraklion was the subject of one of the longest sieges in world history. It held out one way and another for 20 years. A vast amount of economic GDP would have been spent on masons, on earthworks. Some of this would be slave labor, some of it would be free labor. This was, carefully monitored, and the management and the oversight of forts would have been a Venetian state position to ensure that they were in good repair and were kept up to scratch. These were Venice's way of compensating for a paucity of manpower that you could protect, particularly forts connected to harbors, such as at Heraklion or at Famagusta. The importance of protecting your bases. This was one of the keys of a Venetian military strategy.
But in 1453, Constantinople had been sacked by the Ottomans, setting off a chain of events that would rock Venice and Christian Europe. Hagia Sophia, a church for the past 1,000 years, had been turned into a mosque. The old Crusader outposts on the islands of Rhodes and Cyprus had also fallen. And now, 100 years later, in 1663, Crete, the jewel in the Venetian crown, fell after the longest siege in military history. In Venetians hung on a little island just off the northwest coast of Crete. They retreated with the official records of government and the island's holiest relic, the head of St. Titus, hoping one day to return. They were to remain on this tiny island for 36 years, hoping for a return that never happened. But this story does have a happy ending for the Christians. The Ottomans were ultimately foiled in their quest to take Europe, first at the Siege of Malta in 1536, then at the Battle of Lepanto off the western Greek coast in what became one of the bloodiest battles in history.
I come from a Catholic family. Lepanto is both an image of destroying the Turkish aggressor, but also a sort of poignant last moment where Christendom is led by the bastard son of the emperor, blessed by a papal flag. On the back of our fireplace as a child, we had the date of Lepanto. Lepanto is both the end of the glory of Christendom, but also the beginning of those great naval powers, the Dutch, famously the Portuguese, and then the devilish British, based on battleships and cannons.
It was the Polish Hussars, under the command of King Jan Sobieski, who would save the day for Christian Europe at the Siege of Vienna 100 years later in 1683. Among the most accomplished and respected cavalry in Europe, the Hussars were renowned for their bravery and horsemanship in battle. Today, they are still a source of great pride in Poland. By early September, Sobieski and his Hussars had reached the outskirts of Vienna, where they joined a large force of Habsburg armies drawn from other parts of the empire. As the city walls began to crumble, the relief force sprung into action. On the night of September the 11th, 1683, King Sobieski and his Hussars came to the site of St. Joseph's Church, here in the hills overlooking Vienna, to pray before commencing their attack. The bulk of the Habsburg forces made their first assault from the hills to the north side of the city. As the Ottoman commander, Kara Mustafa, rallied his troops to meet them, the Polish Hussars made their first move. Reaching a valley to the southwest, they began their terrifying charge directly into the rear of the Ottoman encampment. Panic spread among the Ottoman troops, who were unprepared for the double-pronged attack. As for Kara Mustafa, realizing the disaster unfolding before him, he retreated in disarray. His armies, overwhelmed by the surprise attack, followed closely behind. In an astonishing act of bravery, not least from the Polish Hussars, Vienna was saved. From the sumptuous interior of the Grand Vizier's tent, King Sobieski penned letters of the triumphant victory for the leaders of Europe. His immortal words, inspired by Julius Caesar, came to define the victory for Christendom. We came, we saw, God conquered. For most Europeans, this was a defining moment. Christianity had prevailed, and Europe had been saved from the infidel Turk.
Those three battles are still the tectonic points which we shape our frontiers from. Lepanto, Malta, and Vienna. It's where the Ottoman Empire stopped. In all stages, you can almost sort of map. Spain, Algeria, Morocco are still based on those battles of the 16th century. Europe is still formed from those conflicts.